Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. So today's talk, although it's a broad topic like gender discrimination, perhaps I can also give you some background about why we are covering this topic as well. So that's okay. Carry on. Yeah. So the reason why we're doing this topic is, I'm also part of this organization called Echo Academy, and what we do is we work with people who have mental illnesses and any form of mental distress that they go through in life. And what we found out through a survey when we worked with them is that gender discrimination was one of the topics that they found that severely affected their mental well-being in the workplace. And so, instead of having a discussion around how to eliminate gender discrimination in a broader context, we wanted to focus on the individual today to see how we can understand how much effort we should be putting in when we face it or someone we care about goes through it, and how we can help ourselves, make small changes towards more equality for ourselves, for the people we care about, and for everyone. So the purpose of today's talk or discussion is not really to vilify anyone or to really just start a movement in itself, but really just to understand how we can all be our own champions and to move the needle on our own. And to help us get there, we have three wonderful panelists. Usually I would introduce them, but I've been told that sometimes it's better when the individual introduces themselves because it's more authentic. So I'll put them on the spot, and maybe we can go from my left onwards. We can start with you, Agnes.
So my name is Agnes Liew. Firstly, I'm proud to announce that I'm actually 63 years old. And I spent 35 years in banking. Before coming home from Hong Kong to Singapore, I was a lawyer by training, then I accidentally became a banker and stayed in banking, truly accidentally. You should hear me on another topic, right? On another talk where I've given on a few occasions. So I spent a good 6 years in Hong Kong on my last posting. I worked with Citigroup for 35 years. I had a blast of a career. And I decided to come home because of family and all that. And I thought it was time to come home to do something different. And so when I came home, I started my own private club fitness center. And it's called Oomph Fitness, and it's on the East Coast of Singapore. And that's where I am. So I am very delighted to be here. I first know Nick. May I? I first know Nick because he came to proposition Oomph Fitness on, being a PR and ad agency and all of that in his previous life. And we did hire his previous company, and that's how I got to know Nick. And I think Nick, is a wonderful person. And even though he left his previous company, I've kept in touch with Nick, and I'm very, very supportive and very happy to see Nick doing what he's doing now. And so I'm here today. I am delighted, and I hope I can share with you my experience as a female professional in a global multinational for the last 35 years, and now as an entrepreneur in Singapore. So thank you for that opportunity, Nick.
Hi. I'm Emily Draycott-Jones. I didn't have to check my own name, I just have it. I'm Emily Draycott-Jones. I've been in HR for 15 plus years now, have my own consultancy business, Clearly HR. But really, my passion for this topic comes from the fact that I'm the co-founder of a group of professional ladies called the Breadwinning Expat Ladies of Singapore. So really, it's how we survive in this patriarchal society in a slightly unconventional, family setting. My husband's here, so I can't say too much about the unconventional family setting. can't say too much. But no, I met Nick through my coach, Valina, who introduced us because she thought I would have plenty to say on the topic tonight. So I hope I don't disappoint, Valina.
Having worked with Emily Draycott-Jones, is that your name?
Yeah.
For many years, you have plenty to say, and most of it's very good too. Very valuable. Now, my name is Bjorn Engelhardt. I am Danish, Australian, Singaporean, and confused most of the time. Whichever country is winning in the sport is the country that I choose usually around that. I'm currently at Symantec. I joined 6 weeks ago. 5 days before I joined, they got bought out, so I will have the shortest career stint probably, but that's okay. My passion around equality, bias, etc., comes from two areas. I guess it's founded by having a daughter who's 22 going through trying to join the workforce. And also I hired a lady, a woman called Oompf, who worked for me for about 3 years at my previous company. And part of the interview process, she said, by the way, I'm going to need a little bit of time to do, an area that I'm very focused on called Lean In. I said, yeah, I know Lean In. I know all about it. And she says, oh, good, so you can help me out. I said, yeah, sure, whatever. And one day she reached over the cubicle and said, so you wouldn't mind help co-founding He for She with a few other guys in the tech industry, would you? Yeah, no problems, I'll talk to you later. Little did I know what I was getting myself in for, but I think it's been a valuable experience and an educational experience, learning really about what men like myself, what an important role we play in the workplace, but also outside and what we can do outside the workplace on a one-to-one basis. So I consider myself a student or someone who's actively learning every day and through experiences and through listening to other people, and hope that somewhere along the lines I can share some things that are important.
Perfect.
And I don't know Nick at all. He just we have only shared emails.
Yeah. And I greatly appreciate you coming, so thank you. We can keep that mic there so we can share. So before we move on, I can also... So there'll be a Q&A portion, and feel free to ask them out loud, raise your hand if you feel like it. But if you prefer the anonymity, then please feel free to go on menti.com and type in this code, and then you can ask your question, and then we'll answer it accordingly. So let's begin with this. So I thought it would be good to start with a broad perspective, and discrimination comes in all forms. It can be gender, race, physical disability, mental disability, I don't know. There's a wide variety. And I always find that discrimination is almost impossible to eliminate. So perhaps we can start off with that question and that elephant in the room. And I want to start with Emily first. What is gender discrimination? And is it fair to say that we can eliminate it, or is that impossible?
So for me, any form of discrimination can come in a variety of forms, right? So it is simply, gender discrimination is simply being discriminated against because of your gender, whether that be male or female. There are lots of assumptions about gender. I'm quite passionate on this topic because I have girl-boy twins. We have girl-boy twins, they're not just mine, right? We have girl-boy twins, and even from a very, very young age, I'm just astounded by, T-shirts for our sons saying, boys will be boys, and darling friends buying our daughter a dolly and our son a helicopter, was it? For that thing that went in the bin? Yeah. It grows with them through their entire life that these stereotypes are okay, right? And when it starts getting damaging is when you get into the workplace and there is harassment, there's stereotyping, there's gender biases, which I'll leave you to talk about because you're the expert on that. But you've got the gender bias topics, there's objectification, there's all of these nasty words that fly around. But when we talk about is it going to be possible to eliminate it, without trying to highlight anybody in the room, but put your hand up if you have witnessed, heard, seen any form of gender discrimination in the workplace. Okay, so basically we're a really long way off being able to, completely eradicate this problem. There was some research done, and this is why I have my notes. There was some research done in 2008 in Singapore. There's an organization called aware.org.sg. They did this research in 2008, and from the respondents that were polled, 54.4% had actually personally experienced some form of gender discrimination in the workplace. Now, whether they were male or female, who knows, but 54.4% had personally gone through that. And it's just, and that's not long ago, 11 years. There has obviously been measures put in place by the Singapore government since then. In 2014, we had the Singapore Protection from Harassment Act in Singapore. So there's the government is trying. We've all seen the photographs and the media posts on what mothership.sg or whatever it is about upskirting and don't allow harassment to take place. But it's there. It's rife. So unfortunately, I think we're a long way off.
Anyone else has a...
I would take a guess that at least that probably 80% of that 50% is women who've felt discrimination. And I said, look, the unconscious bias piece, whilst not forgivable, is a great source of it. I think through my own journey on this, there are so many things that you just don't realise you say or you do. And then when someone pulls you up on it, you go, oh, I didn't think of that at all. And, I grew up in the outskirts of Melbourne, Australia, as a young kid. And it's a bit of for anybody who's lived in Australia or knows the culture, it's very ochre, very male, particularly in the 70s and 80s. And I was talking with John Lombard, who's one of the other co-founders of He for She, and we looked at each other and said, and he grew up in Melbourne as well on the outskirts, we looked at each other and said, can you believe in the 80s we would have been having these conversations and we would be sitting up here talking to people about it? He said, no. And so that's the biggest thing, is knowing what discrimination is. And really to something, an innocuous statement of, well, could you clean up? I was just having a joke today with my ops leader, and we were talking. I said, I'm coming to do this panel, and I said, even the simple things, Julie, that you offer to go and just tidy up afterwards, why are you doing that? Why aren't you just looking around and waiting for one of the guys to do it? And she says, well, I just do it, it's easy. I said, but that's kind of discrimination. All the guys will look at you to do it because you've always done it. And so being aware of what we do, from the simplest things to the most, blatant discrimination or harassment. I think there's probably I don't know if there's a fine line or a big line between discrimination and harassment. There probably is. Is just being aware through what represents, how people perceive it. It doesn't have to mean that you intend it, but if someone perceives it as discrimination as well, it's the start of a slippery slope.
So, in my 35 years in Citi, of course, I've encountered situations which is discriminatory. And I think, it is just impossible to get rid of discrimination in any form, whether it's gender discrimination or otherwise, other forms of discrimination. And many a times when, especially the more senior you get for a female, you will encounter at some point in time some form of discrimination, I believe, or, weird behavior. And many a time I find myself sitting in a boardroom, in a senior meeting, a global meeting or whatever meeting, and it never dawned on me until someone else would point out to me and say, hey, you're the only female at the table. I'm like, okay, so the point is that really what is relevant is that discrimination will never go away, but I think it is important. The question is, how do you deal with it? How do we deal with it individually? So I have never, frankly, in my in all my years in Citi, I never thought of myself whether I'm a female or a male. To me, work is work. I am just asexual. But may the best person get the job, and that's what I expect. And so that's why, you know, I never knew that, okay, I'm the only lone female in the room until it's time to go for a biological break, right? And the guys will all go to the gents, and I'm the only one going to the female restroom. And then there was one occasion when, as I said, the more senior you get, sometimes you get resentment. And I just shared with you how I just had to react off the cuff. And in this big conference call when we had to talk about something regulatory and it was something serious, and I had to tell people what they should be doing. And obviously one of the guys on the call didn't like it. And so at the end of it all, he said, "That was very good, thank you, sir." And I'm like, "Yes, thank you, madam." You know? And that kind of shut him up for good, right? And of course, I laughed about it. So I think it is important to recognize that discrimination will always be around us in whatever form. And sometimes the best way to deal with it is just to let it be and just to laugh about it and not take it that seriously, because you're not ever going to eliminate it. So don't let yourself get eaten up by it.
Yeah, so I want to probe further because both Agnes and Bjorn brought this up in some way or form. So are we doing ourselves a disservice when we do not pay attention to the discrimination or any form of bias that happens because we are so focused on just doing what we feel is right and, you know, in the words of Agnes, just seeing yourself as asexual and just focusing on my career? Does that actually make things worse or better? And I'm just asking more because, you know, sometimes people always insist that we try to fight the battle instead of to play your own game.
For me, I think, you know, it's a question of both, right? In two dimensions, your personal reaction, how you deal with it. And that's important because it affects how you feel every day about your work and your workplace. But at an organizational level, I think it is important that organizations and whoever is from the CEO downwards need to be cognizant of the importance of gender diversity. And I think if the culture and how to build a culture around embracing gender diversity, because once that culture is there, then less of these kind of less desirable discriminatory behavior would present itself.
So there's a wise woman I was chatting to recently about this topic as I was preparing, and she said to me a statement that had been said to her very recently, which was, you know, women want equal everything, but we still want men to open the door for us, right? And it's true, right? It really is true. We still want to be pretty. Yes, it was you. Yes, it was you. You know, we still want to be pretty. We still put our makeup on. We still check our mirrors in the elevator. Yeah, we all do that. You know, so we all check ourselves in the elevator mirror. You know, it's just being conscious that, you know, just because you're a woman, okay, just because you want to be pretty, just because, you know, you check yourself in the mirror, it doesn't actually mean that you shouldn't be taken seriously at work. And actually, it's okay, right? It's okay to feel like that, and it's okay for women to feel that conflict inside. You know, the damaging biases come when women are underestimated because we look good, right? But the same goes as men. You know, men are judged on their appearance, they're judged on the clothes that they wear and what shoes they wear. Sorry, had to point out those shoes and the socks, you know. So we all make judgments about people based on their appearance, which is often gender-linked. So, you know, I just think we're going to have to live with it, and it's all around educating the next generation, and learning from our mistakes, but we're certainly not going to eradicate it. But I think, was it Nelson Mandela said that the greatest weapon is education? So talks like this, talks in the workplace, calling people out on their behaviors, it's honestly the only thing that we can do.
They are nice shoes, aren't they?
They are great shoes.
I was just telling Emily I got them made in Vietnam and how cheap they were, and I'll complain in probably 2 days' time that they're blistering. But I think there's 2 points there, what Agnes raised. One of them was, I don't think I could ever say I've been discriminated against based on being a man. I have been discriminated, and probably when I was younger in Australia because I didn't speak English when I first got to Australia, and foreign name, etc. But to the point, do you fight that? No, I never fought it straight on, and I'm not sure that's always the right answer. Well, 2 things. One, do you ignore it? No, I think that's also wrong. But it's easy to sit there and give out advice and say you shouldn't ignore it, you should stand up for yourself. I think what we've been working on through He for She is not telling people stand up for yourself, you're weak, you need to be stronger, you need to go up to your boss and say, you're discriminating against me because I'm a woman, you wouldn't do that to a man. Is actually fought through an organisation and through events like this, whether it's men supporting women who may not be a direct line of employment or who see behaviour, or women supporting women. I think that's what Oomph spent a lot of time with, lean in, etc. Is the education piece is important, but also knowing how to identify it and how to deal with it. I have seen many cases where, as I've learned through this process, what is just the simplest gender discrimination or unconscious bias, rather than going up and saying, that was terrible, Emily, you shouldn't be saying that, that's not really appropriate, is, a gentle, maybe slightly humorous comment to say, that wasn't really good, or, hey, do you realise what you just said? You may want to rephrase it, or how could you rephrase it differently? Because I think hitting it head on creates a lot of friction. There are times where you need to hit things head on. There are harassment, there is a series, I guess everyone has a compass of where it sits on how bad it is. And there is no such thing as good discrimination or good bias, unconscious bias. But where your own moral compass sits, where do you hit it head on and punch somebody back in the nose, figuratively, and where do you try and bring a softer touch to educate people around it, both men and women, on that topic? No simple answer, because if there was an easy formula, there would be a 2-page book and it would have been solved, right?
Yeah, fair enough. So I guess this is a good segue to the next question, which is, as an individual, how do we think about measuring progress or success? Because, sometimes I think we forget that, trying to fight the good fight for any sort of, social injustice requires a lot of energy and time, something that we don't always have the capacity to offer. How should we as individuals think about success and progress so that we, are in it for the long haul and we don't burn out too quickly and decide, like, what, someone will fight this for me?
Oh, since I have the microphone, I'll carry on. I think it's a really simple question, but has a really complicated, deep answer to it, which I don't think anybody, again, has really solved it. Everyone looks at what's the diversity balance in an organisation, what's your, is it your gender balance, and you set a target and you say, I've met my target, hooray, I'm successful. I'm not sure that's always the right answer to it. I think it's kind of like, for those of you who are in sales, you look at a leading indicator and a trailing indicator. If you're in sales, everyone says you're successful if you hit your sales number, we're on track, we're hitting our sales target. That tells you what you've done, it doesn't tell you where you're going. For those in sales, you look at how much funnel build, what your pipeline velocity is as well. And I'd compare success at the same way is, You know, how many of these sessions are we having? You know, we can look at balance today and say, well, we have a 48% balance of women in these roles, or we've reached in executives, we've got 20% of women executives. What's the right number? I don't know. But so to me, the things that are important, firstly, how many of these sessions are we having and what's the balance? Today, I'd say it's 80%, 70% women. So it's probably, in my books, we should be 50-50 balance between men and women in this type of environment. Another indicator is what types of conversations are you seeing at work? Not company-sponsored activities, because that's mandated. I've been at a few large banks here, not Citibank yet, where we've got told by HR and by our CEO that we had to come to this event. Okay, that's nice. So tick the box, move on, and go back to your conversation. Wasn't that BS, etc. To me, is if you notice a conversation where someone pulls up somebody in a meeting and saying, sorry, that was inappropriate what you said to Agnes on that call. You know, I don't know how recent that was. I guess it was a little while ago. But if you hear that, you're saying, okay, these are interesting indicators of people taking a stance, recognising it, and willing to stand up. That to me is a definition of success, or at least moving in the right direction, rather than just the quantitative, here's my targets that I'm trying to reach. So it's behavioural outcomes rather than the specific quantitative measures.
So being the HR bod on the panel, for me, it has to be around legislation. You know, when you look at when women got the right to vote, when you look at, you know, the rights of women in the workplace, when you look at legislation around sexual harassment, when you look at, you know, the number of cases being brought to court, it shows that women understand their rights. It shows that women feel empowered to say something and to call out injustices. And I think for me, you know, when you see legislation, when you see policies progressing, we're having much different conversations now than we were 20 years ago. To me, that's the definition of progress. And I think, you know, all of us in our workplaces, we've got things like, you know, employee engagement surveys, but, you know, and you can look at what staff are asking for, and there's always a gender element to that. But, you know, I saw something recently, again, my notes, but Project F is an organization that does a lot of work around women in tech. So is a particular interest to me. And what I found really interesting was the most recent survey that they did, women in tech and what they want in the workplace, right? Any guesses for what the number one for women in tech, what they want in the workplace? No guesses? Equal pay was number one. Number two, professional development. Number three was family-friendly working environments. Number four, flexible working arrangements. Now, 10 years ago, that would have been completely different, you know. Number five, diversity and inclusion policies. Number six, visibility of women in leadership. Number seven, gender-neutral parental leave. What was the least important to women in tech? Availability of game stations. Sorry, we work.
So I think Emily touched on many of the points. For me, in the workplace, it starts with how you recruit, and a recruitment process should be gender, as much as possible, gender neutral. So I, for one, would advocate for, you know, making sure that the job descriptions don't talk about whether this is a female kind of a job or is more suited for females or male. And interview process, particularly for corporations, the bigger they are, the more complex they are. But also, I think, you know, it's important to have a diversified panel of interviewers, just so that, you know, there is good representation and we don't become blindly gender biased. Because it all starts with whether you actually are recruiting with a gender bias or not. So we should make that process as gender neutral as possible. And then, of course, when you get into a company, you would think, right, okay, so what does a company do for me to retain me, regardless of whether I'm a male or a female? And retention policies and the practices should also work towards, making work environment friendly for women. They should be like flexible work arrangements, advancement policies, advancement kind of standards. We should, make sure that women get also the right and the opportunity, rather not the right, the opportunity to be exposed to new experiences, stretch assignments, executive coaching opportunities to develop them, just as much as in the same way as the men. I think all these are very important because in reality, at least speaking from the financial industry where I came from, the higher you, at the lower level and at the mid-career level, the men and the male and the female diversity is just kind of less, it's less pronounced, less biased. But the higher you go, the women, for some reason, many of them just drop out. And you got to ask yourself, is it because they don't want those positions? I don't think so. In many cases, they do, but they just don't know how to get there. And in some cases, the company doesn't really, the framework in which the company operates doesn't really encourage them or help them to get there. I think, frankly, that is the most serious challenge in the corporate workspace because at the junior, at the mid-level, no problem, most of the time. Higher you go at the C-suite level, definitely, you see fewer and fewer women. So, to me, success is when CEOs downwards, starting with the CEO, has got to embrace that we want women, we want gender diversity, because it's been proven that if you have a diversified board, if you have a diversified management team, you get better results. And that's why, imagine, right, if you only operate with women or only operate with men, in this case, only if you operate with men, you will be devoid of 50%, half of the population representation, which is women. So it can't be logically good for the company. And it's been proven statistically that if you have a diversified board, diversified management, you produce better results. The challenge is always how do companies, and the bigger they are, the more complex they are, how do companies actually actualize that? And so, HR is very, very important. If I were to work in any workplace, I will be looking for what is the culture of the company? How do they provide, how do they actually encourage women? How do they recruit? Are they male-dominated kind of a chauvinistic kind of a culture? Or do they embrace everyone, embrace women as well? Do they value women? And then what do they do after they hire women in? Do they encourage women to continue in the workforce? Because let's face it, we working women, professional women, I've been there, done that. It's damn bloody hard being a good professional, being a good mom, and being a good housemaker and a good wife. It's just very, very difficult. And, with all due respect to dads around here, it's not the same. The responsibilities of a working mom are really very onerous. And so the company needs to have policies that would encourage women to, every stage in life, you have different challenges. So things like flexible working arrangements, an open kind of open-minded kind of a policy towards that, I think, is a sign of an enlightened management and an enlightened company. I myself actually benefited a lot from it in my 35 years because there were times when I just couldn't work at the same speed as my other colleagues because of family commitments. I had a young family. But then I caught up very fast after my commitments were done. So, many women go through that. And to me, success is how do we get more companies to embrace that kind of practices in their HR management?
Just 2 points, Agnes, I think you raised, which are really important, and I've had a little bit of experience around. One, you talked about the mentoring piece, but I'll go back to the hiring. There is always the view that, well, you know, we've got to hire the best person for it, and I 100% agree with that. I think there's some statistics that say, obviously, if you have no women in the candidate pool, you won't get any women. You have 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4, you end up with a less... You think if you have 1 woman out of 4 candidates, you'd get a 25% chance, but it's about 16%. You had 2, it goes to about 38%. So it's never a 50-50. But I think one of the techniques that I tried to do when Emily and I were working together was tell Andrew, our recruiter, at least go out and find women in the candidate pool. Yeah, sometimes I said, God, I'd like to find a woman to put in this role just so we can bring some diversity, but sometimes you just can't find the candidates out there. So at least set Andrew, who was our recruiter, the task of go and finding women. Now, simple thing that most of his life he's been hiring men, and so his talent pool that he was drawing from was tough as well. So do I need to go and find another recruiter? There's just a whole lot of steps around finding the talent pool before you even getting to the interview. Then the interview panel becomes really important. If I line up 5 middle-aged boring men like me on a panel, and my daughter, and that's what she said to me once, Dad, I've gone and I've met some old man like you who's telling me what my job's going to be like and what the culture of this company is, and you know, what the, well, she said something else, but WTF, what's going on, you know? And she says, why am I talking to him about working with young people? You know, which is kind of, it was an interesting point. And so really being careful about the panel as well. I think it's an important thing just to get the right person. But if you're specifically trying to bring in women into the organisation, ideally the best candidate, but women, the interview panel and how you conduct that, I think, needs thought. The one around mentoring is super important. As part of He for She and Lean In, we've been running some programs, Mentor Her, through some Tech Accelerator events where women have signed up for a mentorship, and some of these were speed mentoring, half-hour sessions. Some of them have continued on as well. I think there are 2 parts in there. If you're a woman, the one thing I've learned out of there, you need to ask for it. Be willing and ask for mentoring. If you're a woman, then offer mentoring to younger people. You know, I know my daughter, and she lives in Melbourne, so I'm not going to pick on anybody here, but she would value, she's going through university, she would value from having somebody not oodles older than her, but who's somewhere earlier in their career going through that process and saying, giving her some basic mentoring, how to look for a job, how to handle yourself, how to get into the workforce, those types of things. If you're a man, make yourself available for women as you would for men to mentor, you know, whether it's through HR, whether it's informal. But there is the difficult part that if, you know, a lot of men, let's say, let's go down to the pub, have a conversation, have a beer, and we'll talk about some of the issues. Now,
We used to do that a lot, though.
yeah, we did that a lot. But Ben, let's go down to the pub, have a drink, and talk me through some issues. Now, whether it's wrong or right, if I asked a woman down to the pub, for the most part, to have a drink, and people started, gossip will start. Oh, she's being favoured, etc. And so you've got to be very careful and conscious around what that mentoring looks like. If it's just formal in the office, then you kind of lose some of that value where you can have that informal exchange. If it's too informal and at the pub, people start gossiping. And I've heard that. Oh, look, she's favoured. She's out with the boss again, or out with somebody, networking her way up to the top. And so there's no easy answer, but just things to be aware of as you're going through that as well.
So picking up on something that Agnes said as well about how it gets harder as you kind of climb the ladder. I think, you know, generally women, and we talk about this a lot on our Breadwinning Expat Ladies group, I love that. We talk about it a lot. I know I'm giving us a good shout out, right? Women hold ourselves to a much higher standard than generally men do, right? A woman will not apply for a job if she's only got 80% of the requirements on the job description, you know, whereas a man will take a punt. You know, women don't do that. but it's just the way we're wired. And yes, there's exceptions to the rule, et cetera, but generally, women will step back and wait to be asked. So, as women and as men supporting women, there's a number of things you can do. I mean, firstly, yes, it's great having a coach and somebody pulling you up, but you know what? You need your tribe too. Every woman should have a tribe of the women kicking them up the arse, telling them, go and do it, give it a go. And that's where these networking groups of people in the same situation as you are just so important. The other thing that we did that you forgot to mention, which was a huge win when we were at Riverbed, is, looking at the job descriptions themselves, a lot of the adjectives, you forgot about that, didn't you? Yeah. That was a good one for you to talk about. A lot of the adjectives in these, in these job descriptions around controlling and managing and directing, they're just not the words that attract women. And there's some, I've forgotten the name of it, but there's a really cool piece of software that, any of you are in the position, it's in the cloud somewhere, yeah. But there's this really cool piece of software that you can put your job descriptions through to pull out any gender-biased terminologies that are within your job descriptions. And just by doing that, you get a different candidate pool.
We actually had one which we kind of ranked about 40%, and they said that's low, 60 to 70 is good. So we spent a lot of time. We got it up to 92 or something, which outstripped Google. So I said, man, we are better than Google, Facebook, all of these guys. And it ranks companies based on their job descriptions. One of the guys who worked for me, he shall remain very nameless, he's very, I think he was quite closed in his mind. He wrote his job description. We ran it through. It was 16. He goes, no, this is perfectly fine. It says exactly what you need to do. It was like build Meccano set number 2, do this, plug this in, screw that in there. I know that's a bit biased in some ways, but it was very, very, very male orientated, and said, Bib, this is, and he goes, I can understand. So, but we changed it, and yeah, I think.
2 women in that team.
Yep, 2 women in that team.
Yep.
So I get to say the last thing about this. So I think something that Emily said is very important. Mentorship, role modeling. If you are a woman employee in your workplace, and if you are senior enough and you know, and people tell you, you're being recognized for making an impact to the company, in the company, then I'm sorry, but you have a higher standard to hold yourself to, because you become the role model for many other younger women. And so it was the same when I found myself, as I progressed in Citi, suddenly I became like, people would just call me up and say, can I talk to you? I'm like, what about? They just want to come and talk to me about themselves, about their work, about their aspirations, about anything. And I think, and I realized that when I realized that what an impact I can be to the younger women, especially the younger women, and I had like men and women coming to see me, but especially the women, you feel a certain sense of you feel good because you know that you're helping people, but you also feel a certain sense of responsibility and an obligation that you benefited, so it's now your turn to impart to them how to get there. So for the women out there here who you feel that you have an impact, you have a bigger job to do. For the women who are looking for a role model, or for help, don't be shy to look around you and who can be your role model. Who do you look up to? And frankly, whether it is a man or a woman, if it is a woman that you're looking for and you find someone whom you look up to, please go and talk to her. Because there's nothing more empowering and more authentic than to listen to real experience. And of course, everyone's experience is going to be different, but it gives you a better perspective of reality and how you can deal with everyday situations. So don't be shy. I think role modeling is, and mentorship is a two-way process, and I think it is a very, very powerful tool for us to improve ourselves and for giving and for receiving, both ways.
Perfect. So all three of you touched on this in some way or form, so let's maybe go a little bit deeper. Let's say someone, male or female, experiences some form of gender discrimination in the workplace. But a workplace can be a tricky place to maneuver when you experience something like this. And if that person is afraid to speak up or speak out against something like this, what would you recommend? Because not all companies are enlightened or have some fantastic way of dealing with these problems.
So since I have the mic, I will start first. I think, at the end of the day, it's very dependent on the individual herself. I would say, if you feel strongly enough, just call it out. Go and see your HR, because what have you got to lose? Your job, so be it, right? You can always find another job, but your dignity is much more important than your job, I feel. So for sure, if you feel if you feel outraged enough, you should simply just speak up for yourself. There's nothing more important and more, it's more critical that you actually do speak up for yourself and let the consequences take care of itself. And if you find that your organization doesn't support you, then you're working for the wrong employer. That's just the truth.
So I think there's, it's really tough, and especially when you're starting out on your career and you think you've got this amazing opportunity, and something, sideswipes you, and it's a really sad situation for people to find themselves in, and like you say, it can impact on mental health. So again, I go back to, you need your tribe, you need your people that you can trust, that you can speak to, because you're not always in a position where you can call it out, or you're not always in a situation where, you don't care about keeping the job, and sometimes you do have to stick with a really shitty situation for a while. I think, a nice way of calling it out gently isn't necessarily always running to HR, because we can't always help you. We often make things worse, to be honest, because, not me, never, obviously, but generally HR, we can make the situation worse. But it's finding ways of having conversations with people, because quite often harassment, discrimination, it's unconscious. People do it, they don't even realize that they've done it. And it's having the conversation with somebody when the emotions have calmed down and saying to them, the other day you made this comment, I just want you to know it really upset me. And, how would you feel if somebody had said that to your sister, or your mum, or your wife, or your daughter? And you'll often find that by doing that, you're not confronting people, you're not calling them out publicly, you're not shaming them, but just having that conversation starts a dialogue. And like we go back to the whole education is king thing, is, people just don't realize that they've done it. They probably don't even realize they've upset you. I upset people all the time and don't even realize I've done it. And when somebody tells me, I'm mortified, and I try to change my behavior, and I'm sure we've all done the same. So, don't feel that you have to go on some big mission. You don't have to start getting lawyers and getting HR involved, but just educate people into how you feel.
So, Agnes, you and I were talking before about, I think, just my company, as I mentioned, is being sold, and we talked about it. It's easier to go and say, I'm going to take time to go look for the right job, or I'm going to do certain actions and take certain actions when you're financially stable, you're confident in getting yourself a job. I know when I was, just entering this tall and young and had hair and long blonde hair and all those sort of things, there's so many things I tolerated, discrimination and harassment in one way, bullying in the workplace, because I needed that job. I wanted that job. I worry about what my daughter or even my son, who's 29, are going to tolerate just because they need that job. And the reality is that probably 70 or 80% of people who work in companies need that job to pay their rent, pay their mortgage, get their food, put their kids through school. And so people will tolerate too much just to survive. and sometimes standing up's not an option. I think this is, to Emily's point, your tribe, your mentorship, whatever you call that around you becomes important. And the other piece is looking at education in the workforce, particularly for the men, around the unconscious bias piece. Because we are guilty, or we are the ones who probably come up with those unconscious bias more than women do. And yes, women do it at times as well, but not as much as men. Is that education piece, and men calling out men and being prepared to do that. I think there's a big difference between what you would like to do and what most people will do. Even managers, there are times where I've sat in a meeting and gone, is it appropriate now? I'm with my boss and something, and he says something, and I go, even at my level, is it appropriate to mention something right now? And yes, you've got to have your convictions and your moral compass around that. But we all either let it slide and say, I'll do it afterwards, and don't do it, or say it's not appropriate, maybe you didn't mean it. That ongoing education is critically important. And I can't stress enough that, but also the courage of senior leaders, male and women, to call out things that they see in a meeting, whether they do it at that time or whether they do it later on as well.
So I agree with that. I think it depends on what the Discrimination Act is. The degrees of severity. If it's not as severe, obviously you react differently depending on the severity of it. So let me just share with you something that happened, of course, some years ago, and it's a piece of something that I think maybe if you. And I'm not advocating that you go to HR at a drop of a hat. You don't, because that's, as Emily says, probably not the best thing to do. But you can certainly find, and that's why networking with other women or other senior leaders in your business is important, because you need to know who you can actually talk to and confide in, right? So finding a mentor is always very useful. And so I had someone who came to me and told me about some other senior who was harassing her, and the form of harassment, I was aghast, right? When I heard that, he was sending her texts like, inappropriate texts, and she deleted it from her phone because she said, "Oh my God, what if my husband looks at my phone and he sees these messages? He will be thinking that I have something going on." So I'm like, okay, so she deleted them, so she had no evidence, but she was very upset because this gentleman was one of the candidates for a very senior promotion. And so she confided in me, and because I was her mentor, kind of, and because I'm a senior leader, so I took it upon myself, and I was like, totally unacceptable. So she didn't do anything, and she said, I can't go to HR and all that. So I advised her what to do. I said, this is the way that you should be approaching HR. You should say this. And I took it upon myself to go seek out the HR director and said, this is what happened. And, of course, all this is very professionally and very discreet, but the end result was this candidate was just, he lost his candidacy because of that. So my point is, and many people don't feel that they are comfortable to go to HR because, HR may not be someone that you just talk to like your friend. You may be more comfortable with someone. That's why I say a mentor would be a very good and useful bounce off for situations like this. And for the senior leaders in any company, your job is bigger than you think. You have a responsibility to look after the younger folks. So yeah, as an example of how you deal with a life situation.
If I could add my quick 2 cents before we move into Q&A. So I've been a mental health ambassador for about 2 years now, and I remember before I decided to be very openly to openly advocate for it. I had a talk with my psychiatrist, and the first thing he asked me when I said, I wanted to be really open about this thing, and he said was, is this something you feel strongly about? Just ask yourself and give yourself a yes or no answer. Be definitive. And if it's yes, then ask yourself, do you know what the repercussions of it is, both good and bad? And then from there, ask yourself, are you comfortable with the repercussions, especially the negative ones? So I think for if I were to translate that into any form of discrimination, I think maybe that's how we should also start to frame the question. How important is it for us to speak about it? If it really isn't, then maybe you can save that battle for another day. But if you feel strongly about it, then maybe it's worth pursuing it if you're comfortable with what could happen to you. So maybe now we can move to the Q&A. Oh, it doesn't work? Okay, then maybe I guess we get used to the everyone has to. Yes. Yeah. Graham.
Thank you so much, guys. My name's Graham. I'm in HR, so I work as a recruiter with an agency called Hudson. Some people know it as, it's just a recruitment agency, of which there are many in Singapore. But we also do talent management studies. So we have a different business unit that does research into things like the unconscious bias and the effect of discrimination, and also the impact that it has on marginalized individuals, or just generally particular genders. So I thought it'd be interesting just to let you all know, from a different perspective, why the diversity is important from a sales perspective. So sorry, I maybe have more notes than you, Emily, but the first thing to acknowledge is for sure that bias is real. Whoops, sorry. Okay. Yeah, really a lot of paper there, sorry. So this is a sample study from Australia. Sorry, it's not Singapore, but in Australia, blonde women had 7% higher salary than brunettes or redheads. So I guess blondes have all the fun, right? So that's a stereotype there. Okay. Another thing is that gay men earn 11 to 27% less than their married heterosexual counterparts. I have 10 stats here, so I won't go through all of them. But it's kind of awful. And what I'd like to say about that is that if we're going to fix gender discrimination or any other kind of discrimination, whether it's people who don't identify as cisgender or hetero, or any other kind of thing, race is a big one as well in Singapore. The most obvious commercial answer is to go and get companies to do unconscious bias training. That's the business answer. But I think it also has to start from each of us personally. I'll give you an example, and this one is not from the paper. So incidentally, my mom is also a lady leader. Okay, she's a woman in leadership. So she actually founded a law firm in Singapore known as Bird and Bird. Its specialty is in intellectual property, but she herself was a HR lawyer. So she went to the extreme end of work that involved workplace discrimination, meaning most commonly senior male leaders harassing junior ladies. Very common, very sad. But when I'm talking about a personal level, right, as another lady in leadership, she had a lot of discrimination. So she told me about this story, how when she was in the office, a client from a really big Fortune 500 MNC came to her office, and she greeted this person because she's the managing partner at the time. And then the client was like, okay, thanks, where's your boss? And then she's like, I'm the boss. oh, I'm so sorry. Then like the guy was immediately like regretful and apologetic. So like, of course, like he didn't mean to be offensive, but I think especially for men in particular, we kind of just are used to that. One of the other statistics I have there is that it's really true that the number of C-level lady leaders are really few in terms of the percentage compared to men. But the reason why it's important to make sure that there's diversity is that it's not just a moralistic and ethical thing that we need to strive for. Of course, that's important. Like we all want to have like fair representation and an equal playing field. But our research has found that, okay, if you have cultural diversity from a sales revenue perspective, for every 1% increase in either gender or ethnic diversity, you actually get between 3 to 9% increase in sales revenue annualized, which means that just like what Agnes was saying, if you have a more diverse representation, not just only of women, but other races, for example, you're more likely to have a more successful workplace. But I just also wanted to touch on the point you made, Agnes, about how you feel like maybe like women are not trying to, the number of applicants maybe for senior leadership positions appears fewer. There's this other thing that has been found, which is called the double bind problem. So just now, like, okay, when you think of like a man in leadership, right? Some of the characteristics you can think of is that the person is, okay, a very common term is bossy. Another term is that they're very directive, or they're very forceful and strategic and high level, right? There's this phenomenon that women in leadership go through, where because for them to be successful, they need to emulate characteristics that typically men are known to portray, right? And then that sort of detracts from what is normally considered a typical female personality profile. So there is definitely a case to be made that women are sort of more empathetic, all right? They're more participative and they are more nurturing. Just think of the fact that like most kids seem to be more attached to their moms than they do to their dads. Like that's something that I think is an important part of the female identity. But if we're looking at the kind of dilemmas that they face, if they act like a leader using typically male characteristics, they are perceived as being hard. So like, wow, why are you so strong like that? That's why this thing where, hey, sir, right? It's super offensive, but it's true. It does happen more often than you think. But if they act like a woman, and this is the kicker, they are perceived as being inefficient. So you can't be too emotional. You can't be too womanly. Yeah. So all of these things are real, but there's a case for having diversity. And short of like your big scale expensive solutions like transforming a business place using like a HR consultancy to teach on unconscious bias and all that, which works and people really do it, I think we should all start from it from an individual level, because I think that is like going to really change things long term. And yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
I think you've got your next panelist, Nick. No, I love one of the points you make, and it's something that we speak about on the Breadwinning Expat Ladies as well, that, yes, there's a lot of stuff that women have to do, and there's a lot of stuff that companies have to do and employers have to do in order to support women, but actually, women aren't going to be successful until men step up at home. Right? And until men are prepared to give up their careers and stay up home with the kids, and until they're prepared to take the phone call and leave work early because little Johnny's gone and fallen off a playground swing again, and until that's normalized in the workplace, that actually it's okay for a guy to go home early, it's okay for a guy to work from home on a day because his child is sick, until that's normalized, women can't take those jobs. I've had a couple of meetings about, roles and consultancy recently, and I've been asked 4 times in 6 months how I will cope with business travel as a woman with young kids. Have you ever been asked that?
Well, since I don't have young kids.
No, but when you had young kids, were you ever asked?
No, I was never asked.
There you go. Of course not.
Thanks a lot. It was very interesting. I have a question because usually I think it's more insidious than direct harassment. Or typically I work in finance and I see in terms of networking, for example, that's where things get complicated because men obviously are not super interested into really networking with a young lady, and network is super important in not only finance but overall in the professional world. So I'm always wondering, I think there are probably strategies, like inviting the guy with his wife over dinner or something like that. There are definitely strategies. But I think the difficult part is really, the fact that it's so insidious sometimes and might prevent you from growing professionally. So I'm not sure what how you have dealt with that, or what's your thoughts?
So basically, networking strategies for women who might want to proposition a man in a very professional way, and how do you get around it? Okay, so I'll go first. You because I have the mic, right? I have the mic. So there's a few things I try to do. I had a very funny situation recently, and this is the thing, I find it funny. So I was chatting with this guy who basically is my job porn, right? He has the most amazing job, and this guy was amazing, and I spoke to him for a couple of days over an event. And, I got to the point when I was just like, when we go back to Singapore, I'd really love to have a conversation with you about what you do and, how you got into it and blah, blah, blah. He said, yeah, here's my card. By the way, you have really great breasts. Now, it was still a really good job lead. It was a really good job lead, so I didn't want to not follow up. So I just made it very, very clear in my email, really great to meet you, really lovely social environment, really glad that we got on. By the way, I have 3 questions I'd like to ask you. They were very professional questions. And then I finished it with, and do say hi to your wife. You kind of have to make a little bit of a joke of it. I'm not going to get all prissy and not follow up on an opportunity to speak to somebody that could potentially be interesting for my career. But at the same time, just make your boundaries very, very clear. And no, I haven't been for dinner with him.
I don't know what to say to that, Emily. I would actually ask you why that would be an organisation that has the culture or a person you would want to work with.
Well, it was more about the fact that he had a really, really interesting job, and I wanted to know how he got into that field.
Yeah, I get that, but I wouldn't want my wife or daughter working with somebody like that. And they probably wouldn't tell me, or I hope they would anyway. I think you raised around networking. Networking is a hard one because that always crosses the lines of social and work. I think just even going back to mentoring, and there is formal mentoring and that companies try to sponsor, and I think sometimes they make everybody feel happy but don't really produce the outcome. And then there's the self-initiated mentoring where people, men or women, say, I would like to be mentored or be taught by somebody, man or woman, who's higher in the organisation or different skills. I think, as I said before in that, I think it's important that men make themselves available to women and do that either by showing that clearly that they're talking about it. Look, I'm open and offering themselves, but at the same time, you've got to be careful how you do that. It's, even for what I've gone through, I guess, the he for she piece, I'd still feel very conscious about sitting down with a woman, say, let's go for coffee and just have a chat if it's not to do with work. And maybe that's just my view, maybe that's my old-fashioned upbringing or something like that. But I think if you can focus on the mentoring piece in a professional manner, asking somebody around for dinner and work, I don't know, maybe I'm old-fashioned, my son will tell me that I'm different, or my daughter may do that, but I don't know, it kind of opens, not for you, but let's say it's you and me having that conversation, it opens for a lot of other people to read more into it than necessary and may be disadvantageous.
But it's a bit, because typically we had a situation like that where one of my direct colleagues Michelin star, just for lunch. But that would never happen with the lady because he's obviously afraid that people will start talking and rumors and stuff. But obviously then you might wonder to what extent this guy might direct my colleague would get promotion or something like that because he has obviously a more friendly relationship with the boss.
Yeah, no, I'll 30 seconds, and I think that's an important one for a man to also notice what they do with men. You've got to be, I think the responsibility of a senior leader is to not just what you do, but what you're seen to be and how you do it as well. And so if you won't go for lunch and you don't think it's right for a woman, well, then sometimes have an office meeting with the men as well. I know, and I would, when we were working together, we had these high chairs in a common area. If someone wanted to catch up, and I was mentoring one of the guys, and said, come and sit at the chair and let's just sit there so people could see it in the office rather than let's go out for coffee or let's do it. So what you do with women, you kind of should be doing...
and your morning walks as well.
No, the morning walks with Alistair. Let's not go into those.
No, but it's important. So a number of things that Bjorn did when I first joined Riverbed, we wanted to try and get away of some of this lad culture and the networking in the evenings, and you kind of miss out on time with Bjorn if you don't go out for drinks. So he started doing, when we had any offsites, when, Bjorn was over in Tokyo, whatever, he'd just invite everybody for a morning walk. So then it's not impeding on family time, for those of us that need to look after to little kids or get them to school or whatever. But, he was making himself available in a very non-intimidating way for women to maybe just, get to know him a little bit better. And again, he always had lunch, and it's a good lesson for any leaders, always had lunch at the benches in the canteen, go downstairs, get your lunch, sit there, because then you're available and you're seen to be available and seen to be talking with all the organization.
As a, if I'm someone that's looking to network with, a senior male colleague, frankly, I would never ask him out for a drink or a meal. Unless and until I know him well enough. So I think the challenge the question should be, is really, how do I start and build a professional mentoring kind of a relationship with this person that I target to be kind of a mentor and someone I can look up to and get help from. It's really all about building a relationship. I mean, you don't just go and say, hey, blah, 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 would you like to come for a drink with me, regardless of how it's going to be perceived by others. The reality of it all is that if you're on the receiving end, it's like, what? What's she trying to do, right? So I think as a practical matter, and for me, the mentors whom I've looked up to and who've really helped me get wisdom are really, many of them are males. A few of them, I don't have that many mentors, but they're all males. And our relationships just grew because, it just so happened that I consulted them. So the thing is, find an opportunity to consult, to ask for consultation professionally. So if they are, I was from banking, so just use that as an example. So if I want to target someone who maybe is a senior in capital markets, I would go and approach him and to seek consultation on a capital markets subject. That's how I would, I would try and open a discussion and try and find a way to develop a friendship with, the senior that I want help from and I want to have a longer-term relationship with. Because at the end of the day, they're all humans, right? They just don't come, come blazing through the door and say, I need help. Are you here to help me? You've got to provide the context for them to help you as well. And we're all human beings, so I think developing human relationships is just so important. And once you get that established, and then they know, so what are you doing? What do you do in the organization? And blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And so that's how from one meeting then, it becomes another meeting and so on and so forth. And by the next few meetings, you get a little bit more comfortable with each other. And I always think the office setting is always the best. That's what seniors would be most comfortable with. Come and see me in my office, or like Emily said, grab a lunch in a canteen or something like that. Something that's not fanciful, it's public, it makes both parties comfortable. That's how I would do it.
And also, just in terms of getting mentorship, you know, it's actually easier for senior leaders to say yes if you ask them a question. You know, so if you say, I'd really love to take 20 minutes of your time to ask you X, Y, Z, they can't say no, right? It's really difficult. They'd really suck if they said no. So, you know, it's much easier for you to get the support that you want if you have a very targeted question that only that person can ask. And they're much more likely to say yes and give you the time. And you've also then very firmly put a box around what that conversation is. And, you know, it's not a senior leader thinking that you're potentially going to pounce on him. You know, it makes it a lot easier to get a yes.
Thank you. We talked a lot about stereotypes and moving away from different initiatives or things like, you know, housekeeping. Why is it expected for women to clean up the mugs or print out the anything that's needed or book a restaurant for a team outing? So I guess what are the little steps that, you know, you've done throughout your career in moving away from those stereotypes on, you know, maybe saying that, why don't you book, asking a male colleague, why don't you book a meeting room for this agenda, or why don't you write the meeting notes for a change? So what are some of the ways where we can move away from these stereotypes that are so tiny, but it's just ingrained in our day-to-day jobs as well, and then just expected for a woman to do that?
Sit on your hands. Wait for somebody else to... Sorry. Wait for somebody else to offer. It's the only way to do it. It's so easy. Women tend to find themselves bursting at the seams to be seen to be more helpful, to clean the whiteboard, to go and grab a coffee. You know, I still find myself doing it. I can't help myself, but you've just got to stop and let somebody else do it. And it's incredibly painful, and you have to watch them doing it not as well as you would have done it. But you just have to sit on your hands, and you have to put your hand over your mouth like this and just not do it. Just don't volunteer, wait for somebody else.
Yeah, I would agree with that from a women's perspective, because if you volunteer once, you'll fall into the trap and you'll do it over and over and over again, and you go, oh, okay, it's my job to do it. I think from a man's side, this is where you talked before about unconscious bias training, and we were doing a lot of that with he for she. We didn't charge any money for it, and even though people said, you're an expert in this, come and do it. But we spent a lot of time, just the simple things. Is it housekeeping? Who should be writing the notes? Who should be doing certain tasks, etc.? And I think for a man, I miss it half the time, but I say, Joe, who used to work for me, Joe, you know, why don't you do this, or somebody else do this, or somebody else do this, and like, or everybody, let's help just tidy up. Make a conscious point of that. I think you build that in, then into the behaviours that everybody does it, rather than expecting Jessica, who was my assistant, just because she's a woman and an assistant, or assistant and woman, that she would do it. So I think you've just got to sit on your hands, and if you're the man, be very conscious of what you're asking people to do.
And also, as a man, volunteer. You know, it's...
Well, men who volunteer and do the housework actually are more successful, the stats show. So, which is stupid, actually, because women are less successful because they do it, but men who volunteer and do it are actually end up being more successful. I don't know if that's the reverse way of thinking about it, that men should do it because it'll make it more successful, but that's the stats on that.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think, you know, just make a joke out of it and just say, hey, why is it always me or the women? The guys should just, somebody, you know, from the boys should just do this for once. Just make a joke and everything will fall in place.
All right, so we're just about out of time. And the reason why I set up the Mentee was also to have all the questions so that I can put it on our forum so that anyone can answer them. But since that failed, I'll send you guys an email with the link to the forum. Ask any questions you'd like and feel free to answer them and help someone out who has a question that's pressing and they would need any assistance. So we've come to the end, and I would just like to thank the audience and the panelists. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, it really means a lot, and hopefully we can continue, helping each other, just make a little bit of an improvement in their workplace. So thanks so much for coming. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Shout out to the film guys as well, Toku Asia. They did the filming, so thank you so much.